Hello and welcome to a new episode of Climate Watch. I'm Fei Fei. When we talk about reducing carbon emissions, carbon here often serves as a shorthand for a group of greenhouse gases, including carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. Today, we're diving into the second most talked about gas on that list, methane. It's a powerful climate pollutant that is often overshadowed by the focus on carbon dioxide, CO2. Like CO2, methane is odorless and colorless, making it very hard to detect. But over a 20-year period, it's 80 times more potent at warming the planet, and is leaking from landfills, pipelines, and even livestock. And according to the International Energy Agency, only a handful of countries and companies have developed real plans to cut methane emissions, and even fewer can show verified progress. The United Nations is now urging faster and more comprehensive action to track and reduce these emissions. So, why is methane so critical to our climate goals? Why isn't it getting more attention? And what should we be doing about it? To find out, I spoke with Marcelo Mena, CEO of the Global Methane Hub and former Environment Minister for Chile. Hello, Marcelo. Thank you today for joining us on Climate Watch. And so, can you first explain to us some of the basics? For example, why is managing or tracking methane emissions important for our climate goals?
So the around a little bit less than half of the warming that we have experienced to date, but really recently, is coming from methane. And so this is the other part is the carbon dioxide that we know for many times. We know that burning fossil fuels generates CO2, and this is a species that lasts over 100 years, right? So actually over sometimes even 150, 200 years. So we're actually experiencing some of the emissions that started with the Industrial Revolution on carbon dioxide. It lasts a very long time. But there's other these short-lived species like methane that last much less in the atmosphere, and in a decade basically disappear. And so why is this important? Because if we reduce emissions of methane, we will see its warming effect disappear faster. So therefore, it's the fastest way to reduce temperature in the short term. Think about it like if you're bringing water to a boil, and then you shut off the gas, it'll take a while for it to cool down. But think about you have something on top of this, which is a blowtorch. As soon as the blowtorch is gone, the effect on warming is gone. So this is a way faster form of reducing temperature than carbon dioxide alone.
Mm-hmm. And currently, when we're talking about tracking these emissions, about methane, where majorly do these kind of emissions come from in our industries or daily life activities?
So when you think about methane, you probably think about cows and cow farts and cow burps. It's mostly cow burps, and mostly through the nose. Just for you to know, this is some science, some very important science that we must share. But really, I'll tell you the breakdown. Around 40% is from the energy sector, and there's around 20% is from waste, and 40% is from agriculture. In terms of energy, when you probably all know that the canary in the coal mine story, in the ancient years, you would put, before sensors existed, you would put a canary in the coal mine, and when the canary would be impacted, it knew that there's some gas that was accumulating, and soon there would be an explosion. That methane gas that was in the coal mine is a form of methane. So a lot of people are extracting that and burning it or putting it to better use. Oil and gas. When you extract oil and gas, there's a lot of gases that come with the oil. And for many years, this has been vented. But it is also part of natural gas. So methane is also natural gas. And so therefore, those are two main sources of the energy. In the case of agriculture, it is enteric fermentation from cows. This is basically how they digest food. And also the manure. And also rice production of the stagnant water And finally, waste. It has to do with the decomposition of organic waste. And basically, landfills and wastewater are the main anthropogenic sources. 60% of methane is anthropogenic, 40% is natural, but not super like absolutely natural, because many times natural processes are also impacted by humans themselves too.
Hey, that's very interesting. Since you mentioned about 60% of the emissions are coming from organic sources, I mean, isn't that kind of emissions been on the planet for like millions of years already? And why do you think now humans can sort of track, not only tracking, but trying to reduce and manage it?
Yeah, so if you think about like when before the Industrial Revolution, the concentration of CO2 was 280, and now it's around 430. So it's grown. I also like to say when I was born, it was 350 ppm, and now it's 430. So it's grown maybe 30% within our lifetime. In the case of methane, the emissions actually have tripled. The concentration of methane has tripled. And so the contribution of methane to warming has significantly increased in recent years. And it's projected to keep on increasing, because as temperature increases, decomposition of organic waste also increases. The natural sources will also increase because there's more microbial activity that will be causing this methane. So that's why it's important. And if you look at the effects, yes, we know that it's the contribution to warming has increased with time. So it used to be a small fraction, and now it's nearly half of the warming that we are experiencing now.
Oh, you also mentioned about a large part of these kind of emissions coming from fossil fuels, like from coal mines and from oil and gas sectors. So it's coming down to, for example, when we're talking about reducing this methane's emissions, do you also propose like a similar strategy towards for managing carbon dioxide, meaning reduce the use of fossil fuels?
Yes, and so obviously we know that it's if you think about like carbon dioxide, it's mostly about avoiding deforestation. It's mostly about reducing fossil fuel use. In the case of methane, it's a lot about our food, right? Because 40% of emissions are from energy, and we could deal with that if we do clean energy, right? If we do clean energy, we're going to reduce the demand of fossil fuels, and so therefore the extraction will go down, and therefore the emissions will go down in many ways. And so the way to reduce methane on the energy sector, which is deploying clean technology. An electric vehicle avoids the extraction of oil, it avoids methane. Renewable energy does the same. So that part is fine. But this portion about food production, because if you add in agriculture 40% and the 20% from waste, 60% of the emissions have to do with our food production, right? Essentially. And so it's a whole new way of having to address things, because we usually don't consider these sectors. We usually don't talk about waste as a climate change causing sector. We usually don't talk or want to talk about agriculture. The good thing, well, first off, is that we could do it in a profitable way that makes sense and basically makes our food system more compatible to a safer climate. For example, organic waste, if you think about it, it rotting in a landfill, potentially catching fire. Yeah, we could extract the gas and make energy out of it, but we don't always collect it, because when we have trash, we cover it with dirt. We don't really trap the gas that much. There's other things that we could do. So, for example, if we compost, if we generate compost, we use it for fertilizer. That's positive. But also that organic waste, we could avoid it reaching the landfill by doing food banking. Instead of letting it go into the trash, we could use it for animal feed, or we could use it to donate to people that need it. Right? There's food that still can be used, and that's something that we could do. We could avoid food loss and waste. For example, many times in developing countries, the food doesn't make it to the store because you didn't store it well, you didn't cool it well, because maybe if you produce milk, there's an infection, and that infection caused the milk to go bad. And so all these things are good practices that we could start improving. So we could reduce the food loss and waste by improving animal health. We could reduce food loss and waste by producing better cold chains, This is very important in developing countries. So that's all a win-win because it allows you to contribute to food security and the cost of life.
Yeah, I just have this question about how big of a percentage can we expect to be, elevate or saved in the food sector? I mean, on the other side, I think the population keeps growing and all of the global population needs to be fed. And that means we still need more food. We need to produce more food. Reducing food loss and waste is important, but how big of an impact will it bring?
Yeah, it's very, very important to look at that because think about it. You're going to the store, right? And of the 3 bags that you bring to home, you only eat 2 and you lose 1, right? It's very wasteful. You think about it. And this is the global average. In developed countries, it's because you eat too much. You put all this food, the portion sizes are too big, you let a lot of it to go to waste. That's like the US version. But in other places, you lose a third of your food because you didn't have the cold chain to get it to market, right? It just rotted in the field, it rotted in the storage because you didn't have way to cool it. And so both are important to reduce, right? And in the developing world and the developed world perspective. But there's a paper that I think tells the most powerful story. Half of the food system's emissions come from food that nobody eats. Because you think about it, a third of the food not eaten, and then the emissions of the rotting food. So you sum both, and that's actually around 50% of the emissions come from food that nobody eats. It seems to be very wasteful to do that because we need land, we need to feed people, and but if we're basically having these practices, we need to really improve them. So that's what you could do. And how do we know this? Is that we've been able to also do the data. So now we know what are the sectors that you need to focus on in the food. And the short of it is, if you do reduce meat waste, right? Keeping That's obviously going to be very important. If you milk also from spoiling, that's all because you think about all the emissions in the production for nothing, right? And so obviously it's a good idea to reduce that. And so this resonates in developing world very much because people might be going hungry. And of course, if we could do everything to get that food to be eaten and not wasted, it's the best thing that we could do. That's the opportunity there. But then finally on livestock, for example, the cow burp is an inefficiency, right? It's if we could turn that cow burp into more food, that's better, right? And so there's a lot of research that we're funding to do that. But also sometimes, when you're feeding an animal bad food, right? A lot of waste, it spends all its energy in processing the food, then really you don't make milk. Spends its energy on processing the food instead of producing milk. And so therefore it produces less milk. And the reality is a cow in South Asia produces 5 times more methane per liter of milk than one in the US or Europe or China, because China has a very optimized dairy system, right? So then we could go to a place in South Asia, we could go to Africa and help the farmers develop the most optimized food so they can make more with their animals. And why is this important? Because the difference between a farmer that has an animal that produces 5 liters of milk per day versus 30 means that whether they're going to make ends meet or not, it makes the difference between their children wanting to continue their activity or going to the city. So there's a very deep connection between livelihoods and reducing methane emissions because basically with the same amount of cows, we could produce 6 times more milk. So then when we're talking about this, we're talking about not reducing methane emissions, we're talking about improving farmer productivity. So there's a win-win opportunity that we're working on globally and working in China too. And that's very positive outcomes in China that we've seen in this case.
So you think the problem isn't about raising animals like cows, but more like farming them more efficiently and in a better condition?
Yeah, yes. I mean, there's 2 stories that are true. There's places in the world that we probably should eat less meat because of health reasons, right? So in China, I think it was near 10 kilograms of red meat per person per year. Argentina's like 90, right? So, there's a lot more. And this is like already unhealthy for cholesterol, for heart disease. So, and so the Western countries are actually reducing their meat intake, but other developing countries are increasing. And the reality is one probably could increase and the other one should decrease. And that world could be a world with less emissions and people meeting their nutritional value. Same goes with dairy. People meeting their nutritional value that are required. That is a reality. I probably should eat less meat, but there's some people in other places that are developing that probably should eat more. And those are two truths that we could live by and actually reduce emissions.
So you're sort of proposing that for different parts of the world, people can meet somewhere middle ground where they consume a similar share of meat. Some of them need to reduce the meat portion in their or dairy portion in their diets. Some need to increase those portions. It's not a one story that fits all. Because right, I was listening to a podcast yesterday about food, and also they bring up inevitably they bring up the ethics behind right now discussions about your diet choices. So, and a lot of them are sort of proposing diets like veganism. I'm wondering about your take.
I mean, people should choose whatever they want and they should decide whatever they want. And people will like to be told what to eat. And if they do it, whatever they do for health reasons, for ethical reasons, they should be free to do both those choices. But the reality is, people are going to continue to eat meat. Farmers do want to fill a role in feeding people nutritionally. And so, what we are out to do is to help fix the livestock production system and have people decide what to do. But it doesn't make a lot of sense to go down this cultural war because it makes farmers be pitted against climate change when they're not, because they probably know a lot more about climate change than people that want to judge them. And they're doing something very noble, which is try to feed people. And they're in the front line. They feel the impacts of climate change. So we could work together. I'll just give you one example why this could work. If the temperature, I actually learned this specifically in a farm in Beijing, near Beijing. If a cow has high temperature, right, it reduces its milk production 30% if it's in heat stress. So we could work on cooling cows to actually produce more, be more comfortable, and we could even have better animal welfare conditions with better practice. Any person that works on animal production knows that a comfortable animal produces better. And so you're not going to find the confined conditions in livestock production that you might see in other meats. I'll just give you an example. To reduce methane emission in milk, it costs 30%, costs 1 cent of a dollar per liter. Almond milk probably costs $1 more per liter, right? So it's much cheaper to fix the livestock issue than actually doing other choices. So whatever people do for health reasons or whatever, it's fine. We are out to just fix the system.
And this is you are out there fixing the systems. I'm also wondering what sort of technologies or methods that are sort of in the mainstream of how to help us manage, track, and even curb methane emissions.
Yeah. So I'll tell you like the cool things on the energy side. Then we're gonna go back to the to the agriculture, which is also very cool. On one side, let's say China. China has coal mines that produce coal for power, for metallurgical issues, for steel, etc. And this methane that was generated before, it has always been historically a safety issue, right? Because there's explosions and so the Ministry of Energy Management has the division to work on coal with the priority of safety. And this safety, then they started we're extracting the gas, right? And then venting it, using maybe coal to extract the gas to power the engines. But then they started thinking, well, why don't we power the engines to extract the gas with the gas we're extracting? It's much more sense, much more clean instead of venting it, and actually use it to heat the mine so the miners could be more comfortable. And so therefore we found that they could reduce emissions significantly with something that has to do a lot with common sense. And China has been leading in compressors that are able to operate on lower concentrations. And so that's really been incredible. And then we could track these emissions from space and see how these emission reductions are occurring. Oil and gas, the same thing goes. I'll tell you a story about a country called Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan is a major exporter of oil and gas. A new company was starting to implement their new wells, and they didn't know anybody was watching. They started just venting the gas, and all of a sudden they're on the news because this gas is not going unnoticed. And now, since this company was caught, the government felt, well, we need to address this. And the government of Kazakhstan is working together with the methane hub that I lead to address those emissions and use satellite images to enforce the leaks. So that way, and they know now, the operators know that, maybe there's no one around, right? Maybe they're in isolated locations, but there's a satellite that's tracking this information. And this also goes with the European Union has established a standard to look at the maximum rate of where they're buying their oil and gas. So these emissions go down. So, for example, the U.S. has a new change of government. They don't want to have regulations to reduce methane emissions. They're going to have to reduce them anyway if they want to sell gas to Europe. It's a new era of accountability. Landfills, same thing goes. When I was Minister of Environment in Chile, I would have loved to know where the pollution was going from landfills. People were always complaining that there's a landfill nearby. Oh my God, it smells so bad. Now we have a way to track where the smells are going through the methane, and we could cover the where things are going bad and fix those leaks in landfills and show that the community, you know what, you guys were complaining about these foul odors. We now know where they're coming from. We fixed it. Here's the new image that shows that this is fixed. That's a cutting edge technology. There's many satellites that have been put together on that. On agriculture, the solutions that we're doing, we're funding all the research to break through, have cheaper ways to mitigate methane. There's cow vaccines that they're doing to target the methanogens. We're trying to breed animals that reduce methane and so therefore actually produce more milk. And we're actually working with farmers like the Angus Association in Texas. They're like, I don't know about this climate change, but this is going to make me more money. So we're still going to do this. And so essentially we're trying to work together and bringing something beneficial. And then I'll tell you about rice. So rice is a traditional staple food globally. When you usually flood the plant and keeping stagnant water, and that's generating methane emissions. So we're actually supporting research to do this without flooding. So we're finding ways to use half the water and 70% less emissions. And so therefore, this means since water costs money, or basically with the same amount of water, a farmer could irrigate twice as much and have twice as much food production. So therefore, it comes at a direct benefit to the farm. These are the types of solutions that we're trying to bring.
So the farmers are actually quite willing to cooperate with you on, tracking and managing these emissions.
Yes, I think so too. I was there when I was in China. I visited the Beef Research Center for the China Agricultural University. And when you go there and not say, we want to change your diet and we want you to be vegan, which is all very valid, is very different when we say we work on improving this. And they received us with a big hot pot lunch with a different meat species that they produce. And they were showing us the different things that they're trying to do to improve their productivity. And so the farmers actually changed their response completely when you say we're going to work together. We're not here to judge what you do. Your work is noble. We're here to work with you to make your job easier. This changes everything when we talk about this.
Yeah, that's like the foundation of any type of communication first, is really to show your respects so that you can continue down the dialogue and then solutions. On the other side, do you also face some challenges when it comes to the curbing of methane emissions?
Yeah, I mean, obviously the challenges are misinformation, right? And so some people started to think, started to say things that are wrong about us, that we were here to reduce livestock production, or that these feed additives that are given to reduce emissions we're not healthy. All these things are sort of the challenges, but and there's places like in India where livestock production has a lot of cultural sensitivities, and so therefore we're trying to so there's always difficult things to be doing. There's protests in Kenya because there's cow vaccines that were used for other purposes, but they're trying to associate it to methane emissions. So there's always misinformation. Also, the oil and gas sector, for example, one big challenge is that nobody wants to. The multilateral banks don't want to invest in the fossil sector because for new sources, and which is super valid. But when you try to fix methane leaks, it's not about creating more fossil fuels, but it's actually making use of the fossil fuel that actually would be lost. So, like, I'll tell you, in some places in the world, 2 to 3% of their gas production is just vented, lost. They lose millions of dollars a year, millions of dollars per well a year, and because you're not managing things well. So, but they don't want to fix it necessarily because for them, sometimes it's more profitable just to build a new well instead of fixing the one that they have. And so these are challenges that we have. The short-term nature of how people decide, it makes it more difficult for us to work.
And do you think there are ways to tackle this challenge? I mean, when it comes to, for example, the managing of carbon dioxide, eventually, in some methods, people are proposing that if you reduce carbon emissions, that also means you can benefit, can bring profits to your businesses or your everyday life. So a lot of people are arguing right now that the economic gains are the main driver for any solutions that people are proposing in climate these days. Do you also are going down in that lane when it comes to the managing of methane emissions?
Yeah, absolutely. 75% of the mitigation and methane in the oil and gas sector could be done at zero to low cost. So this means that basically it's about savings. So each well that you see that is emitting 5 tons an hour, that's like $8 million a year of lost revenue. So very small investments could reduce those costs that you're losing, or you could increase your revenue. In the case of rice, if you're able to produce twice as much food with the same water, it's a no-brainer. So it's also economically feasible. So we're trying to push when we have the solutions ready. So those are completely ready, and that's why we have a big research effort. $100 million already delivered on livestock, and 50 million that we're be doing on rice. In the case of waste, yes, capturing the methane to generate power is a good thing. But also some solutions are actually cheaper. When landfills are farther and farther away, nobody wants a landfill nearby. Then the solutions of composting could provide income. Fei Fei, I don't know if have you heard about black soldier flies?
No. What is that?
It's interesting because my dogs remind me of this every day. So organic waste, can be processed by fly larvae. So there's places in the world that they put the organic waste and they put a whole bunch of fly larvae in these industrial plants, and the larvae just start eating it up and growing, getting big and fat. So you get like big fat larvae from these soldier flies. You harvest them, you make them into fly meal, and you can make food. So essentially, you transform trash into food that has value, that's profitable. So my dogs eat dog food that is made out of fly meal, and it's very healthy for them, and it's very nutritious. It's got a lot of protein. They're using it to feed salmon in Chile instead of using fish meal, and that's what they ate in the first place. They used to eat flies, right? And then and chickens, for example, in gas stations in Chile, the gas stations sell egg that you could buy made out of chickens that were eating these fly larvae. So essentially, it makes their food not only carbon neutral, it generates they're carbon negative because the more of this food that's produced, the less emissions that exist. So these are the innovations that could happen. And this is something, that generates revenue, it generates incomes. And so essentially, it doesn't make sense that we try to push solutions that don't have a cost effectiveness because there's other things that are cost effective to fight climate change too, right? So we need to be doing whatever makes sense, because governments don't have a lot of money. Farmers don't have a lot of money, and certainly cities that have to manage waste don't have a lot of money. So we have to make it easier for them.
Yeah, that's very interesting. In the current days, I think a lot of people are concerned about climate change. It's just they don't really know what they can do as individuals. But we can see this kind of innovation is happening in basically every part and every sector. But then I want to close up with a bigger question, basically. It's about what the governments are doing and how are they going to not only work by themselves, but also among each other, I think, meaning global cooperation in managing, tracking, and curbing methane emissions.
I think if I was there, I was in Glasgow a couple of weeks ago, where the Global Methane Pledge was launched, COP26, 2021. And the US had many countries go with them, 150 roughly countries committed to reducing methane emissions 30% by 2030. But at the same time, the US and China had a dialogue specific among themselves that has continued. And so in 2023, they declared that both will have methane action plans and both would include methane in their new climate commitments, which are called NDCs. And it was interesting because the US, one of the last things that Biden administration did was submit their new contribution, including methane. And then the recent interventions by President Xi have indicated, has said that they will continue having their target being met with methane mitigation. And they already published the methane action plan and other things like that. So just to give you an idea, the coal methane standards that China published in December and of last year and January this year can reduce emissions equivalent to all the United Kingdom's emissions of all the sectors, right? So huge. And this is something that, so I remember that I was in the House of Lords recently, and a senator was saying, you know what about China? They're not reducing their emissions. And I said, well, you know what? Their methane rule is equivalent to all the UK's emissions. So, it's important to say that, there's everybody's doing something. Brazil is hosting COP, and hopefully we'll have a summit on methane mitigation to continue the one that was always done with the US and China, and hopefully we'll have new members. So the UK wants to join, Canada wants to join, Brazil wants to join. So as the US has stepped out on a national level from this commitment, it continues at a subnational level. Other countries are fulfilling their commitments too. So I think it's something that is done because is something that will bring the fastest temperature reduction that we have at hand. So if we want to avoid the worst impacts of climate change, this is something that everybody understands that we need to be doing. So I think the agenda is strong and stronger than ever, because it doesn't depend on one country, because now we have an interlocked global system. So the European Union says, I want lower methane emissions, oil and gas. Japan said the same thing. Korea said the same thing. Latin America is working for something similar. Canada wants to sell lower emissions fossil fuels. So we have a system in which things are aligned to continue to work, make progress.
So you're very optimistic about the global cooperation.
Yes, and I think that China in the recent CELAC Latin American meeting set up also an opportunity to collaborate, because many of these things are developing country challenges. 80% of emissions come from non-OECD countries. So it is very much a development challenge that could bring mitigation and resilience benefits. And I'm very convinced that we'll be able to do so, because it's in the incentive for everybody. A farmer in Africa wants to produce more milk with the same food. Same goes with the same animals. And so the things are aligned, and we're ready to work with people to help them implement that. But really very happy of the progress that China has shown, because they're doing it for the right reasons, because it makes economic sense, environmental sense, and for the communities where these things are happening. So it does bring benefits to where action is taken.
Thank you, Marcelo. That's very interesting and very promising, actually.
Thank you much. Thank you.
A big thank you to Marcelo Mena and the Global Methane Hub, and thank you for listening to this episode of Climate Watch. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe, leave a quick review, or share it with a friend. If you have any questions about our planet or suggestions for a future episode, feel free to reach out to me at fei.fei@cgtn.com or find me on my Substack newsletter, Rivers and Mountains. Until next time.